Hello, my name is Hugh Smee and I'm the manager of Film Hub NI, based at Queen's Film Theatre in Belfast. Recently, Northern Ireland Screen's Digital Film Archive released a new documentary focusing on the work of Derry filmmaker Terence MacDonald. Made with contributions from his family and other collaborators, the film points to MacDonald as being one of the most important filmmakers from this part of the world. The Digital Film Archive is a rich treasure house of filmmakers from across Ireland and Northern Ireland, and MacDonald is one of the jewels in that treasure. In order to explore MacDonald's work more deeply, I was delighted to be joined on the line by Ciara Chambers, Head of Film and Screen Media at University College Cork. Ciara has built a wide range of experience working and studying film archive from across Ireland. She is the author of the book Ireland in the Newsreels, which explored how Ireland was represented in newsreel footage in the 20th century and was later made into a 6-part television series on T.G. Cahir. Through her work, Ciara has developed a love and understanding of amateur film in Ireland, which gives her a unique insight into MacDonald's work and its place in our film history. I began by asking Ciara, what can we learn from film archives? Very often we talk about film archives as sort of something that's dusty and in kind of big metal canisters hidden away, but it's part of everyday life as well, isn't it?
It is. It's so much part of everyday life. And particularly in Ireland, there wasn't really a sustained professional film industry until the 1980s. And so people think that all the images of Ireland up to that point were taken by big American or British film companies coming to shoot on location here. But actually, there's a really rich cultural heritage of amateur films that were being made in that period. And they tell us so much about local rituals and traditions. They show us what particular areas looked like, what people were wearing, what vehicles they were using for transportation. They give us such a rich view of Irish cultural and social life during this time. And yes, many of these are stored as they should be in climate controlled vaults in film archives, and they're not always easily accessible. In some cases, many of them are still with the amateur filmmakers themselves in private collections across the country, because we do have the Irish Film Archive in Dublin, which does an amazing job in preserving all aspects of kind of cinematic life. But there's no dedicated preservation site in Northern Ireland at the minute. But one of the places you can see amazing collections connected to the amateur material of Northern Ireland is on the Digital Film Archive, NI Screen's Digital Film Archive, which is a really rich repository to watch material connected to a range of different amateur filmmakers. But these are really important aspects of kind of our cultural heritage. So it's really important that we can see them, that we can watch them, and we can learn from them. They're really rich for historians as well as, you know, for people interested in representation and various forms of filmmaking.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you obviously mentioned the Digital Film Archive there. I mean, the reason we're sort of speaking today is because the Digital Film Archive have made a film. Northern Ireland Screen have made a film about a particular filmmaker called Terence MacDonald.
Yes.
And MacDonald is a fascinating character, and a lot of his films, I think almost all of his films, are available on the Digital Film Archive now. And I mean, from Film Hub NI's perspective, we're very interested in the idea that filmmaking has a longer heritage than simply Game of Thrones in Northern Ireland. That there have been people working and recording and interpreting life in Northern Ireland for quite a long time, and Terence MacDonald is one of those. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about MacDonald.
Yes, Terence MacDonald is a fascinating case study in Irish film. He was a teacher, a film historian, and an avid amateur filmmaker. He was really quite talented in all aspects of filmmaking: camera, editing, directing, production, and he worked in a number of collaborative projects as well as his own work under Fairview Films, the production company he set up. So he was really prolific. He made 35 films in total, thereabouts, and he made documentaries, fiction, experimental films, comedies. His work is actually really quite extraordinary in the level of technical proficiency, but also in the range of topics and genres that he covered. He's also interested in preserving other types of culture and representation. So, for example, he saved a range of really important photos from the Derry Standard and restored and catalogued them. And he released these as a
Right.
book covering the years between 1928 to 1939. So it's a really
Hmm.
significant visual record of pre-Second World War in Derry. So there are
Yeah.
lots of ways Terence MacDonald has contributed to sort of a tangible sense of community memory that would have gone
Hmm.
undocumented otherwise. And his knowledge of film history was really well respected. And for instance, Liam O'Leary, who was instrumental as a researcher and an archivist in Irish film and cinema going, consulted with Terence on a number of questions related to cinema going in the North. So he was a
Yeah.
known source of knowledge on all aspects of cinema.
And I mean, you mentioned that he made 35 films, and I mean, from for anybody who sits and watches these on the archive, they're extraordinarily varied, as you
Mm,
mentioned,
yes.
in terms of subject matter, but also in terms of what a filmmaker does. So he seems always to be trying to interpret life, sometimes in Derry, but more broadly in Northern Ireland as well, and
Yeah.
Ireland. I mean, he did quite a lot of work with John Hugh
Oh,
in the
yeah.
1960s, which was, specifically about campaigning filmmaking in a way.
Yes, absolutely. So he made films like A City Solitary and Long Hard Road, exploring the history
Mm,
and social conditions of Derry, and also films like 2 Hours from London, which
mm,
highlighted Derry's potential for investment. And that was the purpose of the film, to kind of show Derry as a location for increased employment and investment. So these films had a social function. They were more than just entertaining. And this was
yeah.
something much more than filmmaking as just a hobby, and that collaboration with John Hume was really, really important. They worked really well together, and they
Hmm.
worked on really important kind of social representations. So these films had a very particular function beyond just
Mm.
the making films as a hobby.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose that's the issue for a lot of the way these filmmakers are kind of represented as being kind of cine club hobbyists.
Yes,
But
yes.
actually, it seems to me that McDonald was much more than that.
He was so
You
much
know,
more than that. And what's interesting about him is that he was a cinephile himself. He knew cinema really well. So you can see all of the cinematic influences in his work. So he's making comedies on the streets of Derry in the style of Charlie Chaplin and Laurel and Hardy. And these are really well made, really well done. And audiences who knew these films will relate to them in that way and love the fact that they're set in their local location.
yeah.
And also produced documentaries covering local events and rituals, experimental films. He was really, really good at experimental filmmaking, and he made some very mysterious, intriguing experimental films that were very unusual and very different. So he's really, really good on the technical side, but he also has a lot of ideas and a lot of cinematic influences that really make his work something much more than the traditional amateur film. We kind of have this pejorative sense of what an amateur filmmaker is, that someone, who's kind of
Yeah.
pretending to be a filmmaker and who's maybe not that great. But he was really, really excellent in terms of
Mm.
he taught himself to make films and how he explored all aspects of cinema in his work.
And who was? Sorry, I should rephrase that question. Who do we know was watching these films, and how were they watching them?
Well, interestingly, there were local screenings, as was often the case with amateur filmmakers. Sometimes they screened in local town halls or in local cinemas. So Terence screened in a number of cinemas, but he also screened his work on television. It got the attention of
Right.
broadcasters like RTE. So he was
Hmm.
screening films on TV as well. And there are a number of letters in the family archives from broadcasters commissioning his work. So he's made these films
Right.
on a low budget. He's done most of the work himself, but they're of a broadcast standard, and his films were
Mm.
pretty well reviewed in the papers. So sometimes there are reviews of his work, just like a professional filmmaker, that appear in the local papers, and they were really well reviewed. It was well recognized the talent he had as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What sort of industry we think of? The Northern Irish film industry now has been very developed from where it was, but we think of it as a very recent thing. What was the film industry like in the north around about the time that McDonald was working? Was it small production companies, or was it just all the big broadcasters, and that's how you got in?
It was very, very low in terms of levels of local production of films. There was, of course, broadcasting going on, but
Hmm.
there was very little professional local film production. So there wasn't really a local industry for budding filmmakers. And perhaps that's why so many really good filmmakers were making these amateur films. But across Ireland, North and South, there was no real sustained industry until the 1980s onwards, when there were
Mhm.
funding avenues for local filmmakers. What you had instead was big production companies coming from maybe America or Britain shooting films like The Quiet Man or Odd Man Out.
Right.
Those are the big dominant representations we have of Ireland during this stage, and they are kind of, they fall into two categories: the rural utopia, or the dark conflicted place, that has a lot of local conflict on the streets, and kind of is a dark urban film noir type space, as you see in Odd Man
Yeah.
Out. So those were the dominant representations, and those stereotypes have remained in many cases, in terms of
Hmm.
an international cultural memory of what Ireland is and what it looks like. Is it this beautiful rural idyll, or is it this dark place of conflict? And of course, these
Yeah.
representations came not just from the cinema, they came from news as well, because of course
Yeah.
was a huge amount of mainstream news coverage of Ireland throughout the 20th century, really. And that also characterized some of the more stereotypical representations. But apart from that, there were all of these filmmakers capturing local life and local traditions that give us an
Hmm.
alternative. But those films are just not as easy for us to see as the mainstream films that we're used to, that are quite famous. So there is a film heritage there that's different from the mainstream, and that's different from the external perspectives, but it's more difficult to get access to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's what always interests me about these filmmakers. And I mean, we're not just talking about Terence McDonald here. There's a range of different people who were
Yeah,
working. I mean, you've done work on J.J. Tohill, for
yeah,
example, or
yeah.
you've done work on the Spence brothers, and the impact of the Spence brothers. And it does give you a very, very different perspective of how people regarded themselves, I suppose, outside
Yeah.
the usual media tracks.
Yes, yeah. I mean, if you consider, so JJ Tohill was a prolific filmmaker, film collector, and he made these beautiful travelogues of almost every county in Ireland. They are incredibly sophisticated, they're very well shot, they have voiceovers, they
Mm,
document what these places looked like at the time he was filming, and they also document history and traditions going further back. So these mini travelogues give us such a rich source of history, of place, of location, and they're beautiful, they're gorgeous to look at. And the
mm,
Spence men have made all these amazing, firstly Gothic horror in the 60s, and then
yeah.
sci-fi films in the 1970s. They made these kind of thriller type twist in the tail films in the
Hmm.
1980s, and then in the 1990s they're making films about arts and crafts and traditions that are dying out. So they have
Yeah.
contributed a hugely diverse body of work, that is incredibly significant in documenting those aspects of local culture.
Yeah, I mean, the Spence work is, which a lot of it is again available on the Digital Film Archive. There's a particular one I love, which is called Drumlin, or the Drumlin,
Yes, yes.
which is this bizarre sort of Pied Piper meets sci-fi meets nuclear Cold War terror film. All made on the Strangford Peninsula in the 1970s or early 1980s, and it's an extraordinary film, and it's interesting to think of these people kind of proudly, making their own independent films in the midst of what was, must have been a very difficult kind of time to how we regarded ourselves as a society and all these kind of things, and then people were able to make these films collaboratively and pull them together. I mean, the question I always have is, were people talking to each other? And or I mean, can we talk about a movement, or is it more about individual filmmakers working in their own kind of areas?
Well, it's a little bit of both. Most of them seem to have known each other and to have known each other's work. And there were occasional collaborations, such as between the Spence brothers and JJ Tohill. They sometimes worked together. But for the
Hmm.
most part, the really prolific filmmakers like Archie Reed, like Terence McDonald,
Hmm.
they set up their own production companies. But within those production companies, it was really all them. And sometimes they
Hmm.
collaborated with people to maybe do a voiceover, a narration. They had actors, of course, but really they ran the show, and they
Yeah.
sometimes did everything. So the Spence brothers are famous for their props and their model sets, which are incredible. They're it's a story in itself to explore
Mm.
the way they made their films with no budget. And in fact, there's a documentary they made specifically about that, about no budget filmmaking, showing other young filmmakers how to make the most of very limited resources. And that gives a really interesting creativity, because it's always about problem solving. Okay, so how do I shoot, particularly when they're working with film, because remember, most of this work was pre-digital, so and
Yeah, of
even
course. Yeah.
pre-video, they weren't in the position where they could see what they'd shot immediately. Sometimes they were editing in camera and sending off their film to be processed, and they wouldn't see for weeks if it had come out, if it was okay, if
Yeah.
they were happy with the framing and so on. And then the post production was an art in itself, in terms of editing and splicing the films together and maybe adding sound. But
Mm.
sometimes they worked, for example, with local drama groups, and they might have involved friends or family in productions. They might have been collaborations with local journalists or actors or artists, like the cartoonist Roel Freers, who appears in quite a few amateur films. And he seems to have worked with both with both acting in the films and also making artwork and titles for the films as well. So
Right.
he acted in films for both Archie Reed and for the Spence brothers. So those kind of collaborations that they set up were really, really interesting. But in terms of a movement, there's definitely something unusual going on with these filmmakers in Northern Ireland that seems to be different from amateur producers in the south of Ireland or even across Europe. There seems to be quite a few filmmakers in Northern Ireland that we might go as far as defining as auteurs, that much debated term,
Yeah.
where the director is kind of the author of a body of work. And that's because there are thematic similarities in their work, and they were really quite accomplished in what they were doing. And even if they tried their hand at a range of different genres, there's something striking in their body of work. So it's kind of almost a recognizable style or a sense of humor or a
Mm.
quirkiness, but there's something you can see across a body of work with these filmmakers that's recognizable. And this seems to be quite unique. So while across Europe there were cine clubs making fiction films, for example, it's less common to see individual filmmakers producing a significant body of work. And I wonder if this
Mm.
happened in relation to what we were talking about earlier, the lack of a local film industry. If there had been more paid activity, perhaps these amateur
Yeah.
filmmakers would have given up their day jobs and gone into the industry in a professional capacity. And had they
Mm.
been professionals, they wouldn't have been producing these films, because they would have been beholden to other creative and economic forces. They wouldn't necessarily have chosen the innovative approaches to technology that they had to choose because they'd limited resources, if they had a lot of expensive equipment to hand. And the Spences in particular really pride themselves in the freedom they had with a no budget approach, that no one was going to tell them how to frame their work, how to produce their work, or to add an happy ending or change a shot or cast
Mm.
a particular person. So Terence MacDonald is similar in this. He wouldn't have made the films he did if he was commissioned, because he would have had to be cognizant of particular political sensibilities. He may have been
Of
censored.
course.
So it's precisely because he had creative control over his work that he was able to make the films he did, and there weren't those other restricted forces at work when he was filmmaking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that seems to be what's so rich about all these filmmakers is they really were just plowing their own furrow
Yes.
and making artistic decisions in their own right, as opposed to, yeah, as you say, the kind of the web of funding bodies or commissioning, or the sort of creative choices and the pragmatic choices you often have to make to get larger budget stuff made. I mean, it is quite an interesting kind of outpouring. There's one film by McDonald, which name escapes me for the purposes of this interview, which is an experimental film about a German bomber.
It's
That's up on
Nibelung. Yeah,
the yeah.
it's a film called Nibelung. It is
That's
absolutely fascinating, and it's an award-winning film. It's
yeah.
so expressionistic and experimental in its style. It's really mysterious and intriguing, really enigmatic. It
Mm.
it's quite dark in many ways. It's kind of striking, and it's kind of uncomfortable, and it seems to be a commentary on war and the kind of the fallout of war and humanity's repetition compulsion when it comes to acts
Yeah.
of war. It's really, really fascinating. And also there's something in it about film itself, because there's a scene in a projection room that's really a commentary on how films are constructed for us. So I think he's making a commentary here on how we engage with film, how often perhaps it can be propagandistic, how we relate to it, how it can persuade us, how it can give us certain information and censor other aspects of
Yeah.
information. So it's just a really, really fascinating film. And thematically, there's so much of interest there that you could read into it.
Yeah, I mean, when I watched it, I was shocked at, because I think you do, naturally sort of think, well, amateur filmmakers, that there's only a level of depth that they're going to go to.
Yes,
But when you
yes,
watch a film like that, you do suddenly realize that you're actually in the hands of someone who can deliver very sort of serious issues, and does them in a particularly cinematic way. And it uses a huge amount of kind of, I think there's archive work in it, and there's sort of a montage and all sorts of different elements of technical work that were
absolutely.
quite highly developed. And it's really interesting. There's another filmmaker who worked, I think, for the BBC, called Robin Wiley,
Yes,
and who made a huge amount of fascinating little documentaries. Thinking of the Doggy Men, but also Sing
oh
Orange, Sing
yeah,
Green.
of course.
Yeah, which really kind of give you an insight into life there, but also are sort of filmic statements in their own right, in the way that they're filmed, and the kind of almost like a kind of manifesto about documentary making as well. And it really does open up a huge sort of cultural awareness that I think that people don't associate with Northern Ireland, really.
Yes, and that's why alternative filmmaking is so important, because it gives us
Mm,
something visually and aesthetically that's different, and it
yeah,
draws our attention to the processes of filmmaking in a way that standard continuity editing and mainstream production does not. We go in there and everything we see is invisible to us in terms of the constructs of film that
yeah.
come together to make the film for us, and that's because we're supposed to just enjoy it as entertainment. We're not supposed to think about it too closely. But with these films, they're asking us to deconstruct our relationship with cinema, and asking us to think about the visuals that we're looking at and how they're represented to us thematically. And that's asking us to engage as viewers in ways that mainstream cinema doesn't always do. So that's why
Mm,
these films have an artistic agenda and significance that goes far beyond just entertaining us. They're asking us to think about what we're looking at.
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's an involvement or an inclusion from the audience. Whenever I've been in a sort of collective watching of any of these kind of films, there's a real sense that you're part of sort of the filmmakers are you, in a way.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a trite way to put it, but I think it's a kind of a sense that that do-it-yourself element within this, and creating a craft and things like that, means that there's less of a barrier.
yes.
I think people, especially with modern filmmaking, there's a sense that it would be almost impossible for someone to even just start to do it without a huge, long 10-year, 20-year apprenticeship or whatever it might be. But there is a sense with these films that they are from us and about us, and sort of belong to us, which I think is kind of very interesting, and quite different. There was one sort of, I suppose, as an academic, and someone who's written about quite extensively these sort of things, do you find yourself sometimes, um, what's the word? The sort of, I'll rephrase that question, Ciara, if you don't mind, because I went at it the wrong way. As as an academic, what attracts you to these kind of films and this kind of movement?
Well, these films are such important social documents above anything else to me, that's kind of the main attraction to them, what they can tell us about the times in which they were made, because film is always a cultural barometer. It tells
Yeah,
us so much. So, for example, the Spence work in the 70s that's emulating 1950s B movies is fascinating, because just as the B movies were working out all the Cold War tensions, well, I
yeah.
think the Spence work in the 1970s is working out everything that's going on in Northern Ireland. Now, they will say we are apolitical, we're not interested in politics, that's why we're interested in cinema. We wanted to go away from politics and make films that weren't even set in Ireland. But there's still
Mhm.
a mark of something, I think, that's going on in terms of a film that's made. You can't fully escape its location, its social circumstances that will feed into it in some way. But also at this time, Ireland North and South has been endlessly covered by external filmmakers and news agencies, as we've talked a little bit about, often in really simplistic ways. Whereas these films capture what life was like from a local perspective, whether they be fiction or documentary. They chart local customs, rituals, habits. They chart family and community life. And film, whether it be in documentary or narrative form, is such a good barometer for giving us a sense of a culture, and people's habits. And it tells us so much about locations. It tells us so much about cultural life.
Mm.
So I think it's not just that these films fill in gaps that are missing from mainstream production. They do a lot more than that. They give us a local perspective, a local commentary that is completely alternative to the representations that we're used to by external filmmakers and news companies. So they're a really rich part of our culture and part of our heritage.
Mm.
And that's why it's really interesting when you say they feel part of us. That community link to them is so strong and so important. And I'm just thinking even of one example of Terence MacDonald, where he made the little kind of mini comedies that were screened as part of the pantomime every year in Derry for a while.
Oh
So,
yeah, I heard
so
this
people,
story.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, it's fascinating. So there's an interval, and people watch a film he's made on the streets of Derry, sometimes with the actors who were in the pantomime. So the
Mm.
audience had such pleasure in seeing on the big screen their streets, you know,
Mm.
and their location, their city. There was a real sense of seeing the action happening there. And it's exactly as you mentioned, that notion of this can be done. This is a place where cinema can be made. It doesn't have to be based in
Mm.
Hollywood. This is somewhere where cinema can be made, and we can all be filmmakers. We can all pick up a camera and start to learn that. And yes, there is a
Mm.
sense of sharing their techniques. A lot of these amateur filmmakers are very interested in talking about the means of production, sharing tips and techniques with other filmmakers who were interested. So there's a real sense of generosity of experience here as well in relation
Mm.
to how they screen their films for other audiences.
Yeah, I know that John Davis, or John T. Davis, as he's better known, I suppose. He sees Pennebaker, and then he's kind of picking up things as he goes along in terms of
Yes.
working with cameras and all that sort of stuff. And then I suppose Shell Shock Rocks and his later films, that's a very good example of that. Someone picking up a camera and just trying to record a scene that was there at the time.
Yes, and then
Mm.
also doing that little bit more in terms of asking us to think about what we're looking at visually.
Yeah.
And that makes it a more, I suppose, sometimes a more intellectual experience than just mindless entertainment. And
Mm.
can we can fall into a pattern of being passive viewers with mainstream entertainment. We just want to be entertained. We don't want to think about it too much. But cinema has another function that's supposed to make us think about what we're looking at and think about our relationship to it and what it's telling us.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. My final question, I suppose, Ciara, is there any three that you particularly recommend from your knowledge of the archive? Any three particular films?
Right. Okay. Well,
I'm gonna put you on the
gonna
spot.
find it.
Sorry.
I'm gonna find it hard to keep it down to three, but I'll do my best, and let's see let's see where it
Uh-huh.
goes then. So in terms of Terence MacDonald, I think A City Solitary is one that is really worth starting with MacDonald's
Mm.
work. So it's an exploration of the history of Derry and contemporary social circumstances, and it was a collaboration with John Hume, and the voiceover is by the Reverend Brian Hannon, father of Neil Hannon of Divine Comedy fame. So it had a cross
Small,
community
it's a
element.
small world.
Yes, exactly. And it was seen as a really kind of sincere and impartial attempt at exploring some social issues. And it was one of the ones that was screened on television and renewed quite favorably in the newspapers. And one
Mm.
really poignant review said, there were few local viewers who would not re echo its closing sentiment that the future of this city of divided loyalties depends on the unified efforts of all its people. So there was a real sense that this was capturing the mood of the time, and that it could be kind of
Mm.
educational and insightful for people to see this film. But there's one other one by Terence MacDonald, which I think is really striking as well, and it's called The Open Door. And it's a
Mm.
collaboration between John Hume and Terence MacDonald again. It tells the story of a fictional patient going to the Grantia Psychiatric Hospital, and it shows the
Right.
facilities, and it talks about the process of dealing with mental health issues. It's really sensitive and thought provoking and utterly relevant now. It's really striking how relevant it is now. It talks about dealing with the stigma of mental health issues, and it offers a really practical and optimistic outlook outlook, and I think it just is actually really way ahead of its time. So that's another one that's really worth looking at. There's another filmmaker called Archie Reed, who has some really interesting work on the digital film archive as well. And another one that's
Money's finest.
interesting, yeah, interesting to look at now, is The Seventh Angel.
Yeah.
Quite kind of film made in 1962, so it's the same year as the Cuban Missile Crisis, and closer to home, the campaign for nuclear disarmament protested against plans to build nuclear submarines in Belfast, Harland and Wolff shipyards. So The Seventh Angel is tapping into all those tensions, and it shows the protesters as part of a fictional narrative where a man receives a mysterious phone call about the end of the world, and it is his job to spread the message. So it's kind of really striking, and also a little bit different to what we might be thinking about now as well. And obviously the Spence brothers, their work is really beautiful and should be seen as well. There's quite a bit of it on the digital film archive, in particular Tudor Style, which is a lovely exploration of one of their cinemas, because the Spences are not just famous for filmmaking, they're famous for the cinemas that they have recreated, which are kind of almost like havens to the cinematic past. There are these gorgeous spaces where they've taken seating and memorabilia and poster boards, and they've reconstructed these beautiful screening spaces where they screen their work and other work. And so there's a film called Tudor Style from 1979 that looks at the Tudor cinema, and there's another music reference coming up here. This is, of course, the where Tudor Cinema Club got their name. So popular band.
Is that true? Is that a connection?
Yeah, apparently it was from a mispronunciation of Tudor cinema that gave them the idea for Tudor Cinema Club. So it has that kind of popular cultural reference. And the Spence brothers that's not the only musical reference that they have. Really interestingly, they made a film called Keep Watching the Skies in 1975, the remake of The Blob, the debut feature film for Steve McQueen from 1958. And it has been remade again by David Garrity, a musician from the band Bell X1, and he has a solo project. And he's made
something in the Pines. Meet Me in the Pines.
That's right. Yeah. So Join Me in the Pines is the music video he made. Join Me in the Pines is the moniker he uses. The name of the video is Feel So Heavy, and it's basically a music video that re-edits Keep Watching the Skies. So here's this 50s B movie that's re-edited into an amateur film in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, that's re-edited again into a digital music video in the 20th century, so 21st century I should say. So it's a really interesting story of how that content can migrate and change into something else, and have all these interesting cultural references. So those films can be seen on the IFI player, on the Irish Film Archives player, both Keep Watching the Skies and the music video that was made, Feel So Heavy. They can both be seen there if anybody's interested in exploring those.
Right. Well, that's more than enough choice for anybody to get in. But once I've always found once you start watching one, then you start to get more and more. I mean, I know our Film Hub members, Ballyclare Picture House, did a special on Archie Reed about 2 years ago that we were happy to support, where members of his family were there, and there was music, and they screened some of the films there up in Ballyclare Town Hall as well. And that was a very, very good example of how these films are. You can take a lot artistically, and you can take a lot of kind of historical and cultural stuff, but there's also that sense of place in these films.
Oh yes, most definitely.
Certainly from reports from that night, there was very much a sense of sort of pride that there were local filmmakers there. That it didn't all just start in 2006. There's been a long heritage of filmmaking here,
Yeah, there is, and it's so great that these films can now be seen and shared with the general public, because they do belong to us. They are, they are such an important cultural record for us, and it is addictive once you start going into the digital film archive. It takes you on a treasure hunt through the archive, because there's so much amazing stuff in there, and it's beautifully curated, and it's fascinating to see it, and it can certainly pass several hours once you start.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, the catalyst for this conversation was a documentary that Northern Ireland Screen had put together about Terence MacDonald, which interviews some of his sons and some of the people who worked with him on films and things like that. So that's something to hunt out as well to
Yeah,
learn more about
beautiful,
Terence.
the
Well,
beautiful side
Ciara,
of him. Yeah.
Ciara, Ciara, thank you very much. That's been
Thanks,
a
me.
fascinating discussion about film archive and what it means
It was lovely
and
to
what
chat
the
to you about all of this.
yeah. No, it's always a pleasure. Well, I hope it's a subject that continues. I mean, obviously through your work, but I think that more and more people are getting kind of interested, and more screen agencies and organisations like the BFI are aware of the power and importance of film archive to communities and to people. So here's some more of it.
Absolutely. Here's hoping a lot more.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that chat with Ciara Chambers, and thank you to her for taking the time to do it. We learnt about MacDonald, but we also learnt and discussed some of the most interesting aspects of the hidden cultural history of Northern Ireland represented through its filmmakers. If you want to learn more about the films, explore the collections, and find gems of your own, the Digital Film Archive is available on digitalfilmarchive.net. And if you go to Google and search for Northern Ireland Screen Digital Film Archive, you can find it that way too. It's worth at least 10 hours of your time. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for listening.